Okay, I think you're live now.
There are several people looking forward to seeing it on the internet.
Yes, okay, we're on it. We're live.
We're live? Okay. This is Brian Lance with the Schiller Institute here in Houston. This is already almost the end, the 28th of January of 2017. I'm going to be speaking today about three topics, two topics briefly, and then a third. I'm going to be speaking about the nomination of Stephen Mnuchin to be the U.S. Treasury Secretary, and this nomination has to be stopped. We just received only hours ago the announcement from the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Orrin Hatch, that Mnuchin's nomination discussion and vote is moved up till Monday, tomorrow, the 29th, or I'm sorry, Monday, the 30th of January. So this is just the day after tomorrow. And then Monday evening will be the Mnuchin vote. So we have a very specific amount of time here to move rapidly. And we've already sent out of the national office, letters out of New York have gone out, emails mobilizing for this, directing calls through the weekend into the Senate offices, which is most important because the vote is going to be in the Senate Finance Committee, and then it will go to the floor for a Senate vote. And so that's where it has to be stopped. That's the process of confirming a nominee for the Treasury in this case. So we're already in mobilization, calls into the U.S. Senate in particular, but also calls into the White House to register that this nomination must be stopped. And I want to emphasize that this is not a question of being for or against President Trump. That's really nonsense at this point. You get enough of that in the media, mass media. The fact of the matter here is that there is an effort underway coming out of London, the City of London, and out of the royal household to stop or otherwise box in Trump, to ensure that Trump fails as a presidency. We've seen it since the election. Complete hysteria over the election of Donald Trump as the President of the United States. And if you look at these charges being thrown at him, they're coming out of London. And I'll come back to that in a second. The second issue I want to touch on as well is Glass-Steagall. The reenactment of Glass-Steagall legislation to separate so-called investment banking, that is the global casino, from commercial banking. And if you separate the global casino from the backstop of the US government and US Federal Reserve, that global casino will collapse. That Ponzi scheme will collapse. But more importantly, by saving the commercial banking system in terms of its core functions, we can rebuild that banking system as part of rebuilding the US economy, and we'll have more to say on that. The third subject I'm going to discuss, hopefully dilate on a bit, is what's the alternative? How should we, as well as President Trump and his team, be looking at the question of economics? Obviously, the people who have been running economic policy in the institutions such as the IMF and World Bank, the Federal Reserve, and so on and so forth, the Council of Economic Advisors, have been an utter disaster for mankind. Their methods have failed completely. So how do we have to look at it? And besides, I mean, most Americans are completely buffaloed by all the razzle-dazzle of these pontificators getting up there, these Delphic personalities, you know, the Samuelsons and the Milton Friedman's in his day, or whoever the current head of the Federal Reserve is, or the New York Fed, or whatever, and pontificating in verbiage which explains absolutely nothing in terms of money supply and so on and so forth. So what is the alternative way in terms of the American system school that we've discussed in the past in terms of Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton? What is the way in which to approach an actual understanding of economics so that we can be guided as citizens as well as policymakers in ensuring a durable future for our nation and mankind? So we're going to take up Lyndon LaRouche's concepts of energy flux density and potential relative population density. But we're going to focus primarily on the first, energy flux density, as LaRouche develops it. That is in terms of physical economy. We're going to go away from the money, the funny money process, and we're going to look at the process of reproduction, mankind's process of reproduction, how nations reproduce themselves, and so forth. What are the parameters of that? How can you examine that? Not in terms of money, because obviously money doesn't have anything to do with that, really. But how do you look at that as a science? And that science, as I hope you'll see, actually becomes a reference point for really comprehending other spheres of scientific endeavors. It really becomes the compass for comprehending science as a whole and measuring the progress of science in other fields as well. So back to the nomination of Steve Mnuchin, who is up for nominee for U.S. Treasury Secretary. Now, as came out in the hearings on January 23rd, just this last Monday, in the U.S. Senate, in the Finance Committee, Mnuchin, first of all, is a predator, an absolute predator, who's been engaged in one financial wingding after another, and with tremendous damage being done along the way. The most obvious, the one that came up, was featured in the hearings and came forward in the hearings this last Monday, was his role in NatWest, the California bank that he organized together with other partners, including George Soros. That bank was turned into a mortgage foreclosure mill, in which thousands of people lost their homes, and the bank grabbed their assets, that is their property. And it came out in the hearings as well that, you know, all of the techniques of the day were utilized, including these robo-signature forms, you know, that were filled out and processed, you know, as if examined by actual individuals and so forth, and these things were just being processed, you know, through a printer. But there's much more to Mnuchin, which should raise alarm bells. Despite all that was discussed in the hearings this last Monday, primarily by Democrats opposing Mnuchin, at least in terms of the hearings, in terms of their approach to the hearings, who knows how they'll vote, that's up to us. No one mentioned George Soros. Now, this character, Mnuchin, got his start 12 years in Goldman Sachs, and then he was brought over to work directly for the Soros Fund Management, and then ran Soros Fund Management Capital for George Soros. I'm not going to go back and fill in the blanks on George Soros. Hopefully you're familiar with him, or you can do a search of his name and simply go to LaRouche PAC and do a search there of his name, for example, and get the background on one of the biggest financial predators in the world. Soros himself, I would just emphasize, is that coming out of Hungary at the end of World War II, where during the war, he had worked and collaborated as a very young man with the Nazis and fingered Jews, fingered where they had hidden their precious paintings and other physical goods. And of course, once their goods were stolen from them, they were carted off to the concentration camps. Soros is proud of this background. It's where he learned his value-free approach to financial speculation. And you can go online and find the TV interviews done, American TV interviews done with him in more recent years, in which he proudly defended what he had done in Hungary. But from Hungary, he went to London, and because of exactly his predatory nature, he was picked up and became a City of London speculator, financier, and went on to form Quantum Fund and handled the fortune of the royal family. From there, he went to the United States. He ended up with American citizenship. Quantum Fund is now a matter of blocks from Trump Towers. And so you really have, right there in New York City, you have the Manhattan Project of LaRouche. You have George Soros and his Quantum Fund. And of course, you have the embattled Trump presidency. Embattled in the sense that the direction forward is not yet clear, and something we have to ensure the American people guide appropriately. Now, so the Senate, as I said, the Senate hearings are now set. The Senate Financial Committee hearings are set, and a vote, according to the Chairman Orrin Hatch, will be taken on the Mnuchin nomination this Monday evening. That'll be the 30th of January. So we have something like 48 hours, maybe a little bit more, to continue the mobilization already underway and ensure the Mnuchin nomination is stopped. Now, the backdrop is the British attempt, and I'm not talking about the British people, but the British oligarchy, including specifically the royal family, attempt to box in the new Trump presidency. Just in the last 48 hours, we've had Prime Minister Teresa May land on our shores, meeting with the Republican congressional delegation in their retreat. That was on Thursday, I believe. And then on Friday, the meeting with President Trump at the White House. I just you can just pass this around. If somebody could just pass these around. This is just copies of the an article that kind of saw Prime Minister Teresa May off from England for her visit to the United States. Is from the Spectator, published in London. The feature article is titled, "Will Donald Trump be assassinated, ousted in a coup, or just impeached?" In this country, you would have, at minimum, you would have a proper sit down between the Secret Service and the individual who wrote this and the editors and publishers of this, because of the direct threat to the president that this article entails. It's not simply in the headline. It's which I'll just hold up here to just give you a sense of what it looks like. But you can go online and get this article and read it yourself. But this is the kind of visceral reaction that we've seen since the Trump election on November 8th. Recall the sexed up dossier, and I'm skipping over a lot here, but there was the dodgy sexed up dossier that was released a few weeks back. We talked about it just after its publication, which purported to be reports of shenanigans on the part of Donald Trump in Moscow, orgies, prostitutes, on and on, and also include a reference to a purported trip that was made by LaRouche people with Trump's people to Moscow as go-betweens between Putin and Trump. This sex-up dossier was the output primarily of a gentleman named Christopher Steele, who is a former top MI6 agent, that's foreign intelligence agent of Her Majesty's Secret Service. Christopher Steele, this has all come out and been confirmed even by Teresa May, the Prime Minister. But in England now, after this initially came out in such press as the London Guardian, the British government issued an order that his name could not be printed in the British Isles. Because that's, you know, the printing of a name of a British MI6 agent in Britain is not, you know, this is not allowed.
Right.
So any thought that Mr. Steele's role with MI6 is somehow something in the past is just not the case. As the Russian embassy tweeted at the time, once an MI6 agent, always an MI6 agent, which certainly is true. So this is some of the British pedigree of the ongoing operations against Donald Trump. And so you have Soros, and Soros has funded dozens of these organizations that are involved in these mass demonstrations against Trump that we've seen in the last few weeks directly. That's just documented. So you have that, but you also have Soros and company for the British Crown on the inside, and that's what Mnuchin represents. And so I want to emphasize this. This is not about left versus right or anything of the sort. You know, this Soros and company, you know, the old term was synarchism, or as the U.S. Army intelligence termed it in their files, Nazi communist. They work right and left. The point is to tear down nation states, to tear down the institutions of functioning republics and emerging republics as well. And so they're quite willing to use those that come in you know, in a number of colors. And really that's just the forerunner to what we now know of as colored revolutions that utilize all sorts of axiomatics, they're based on different profiles of the population, democracy, you name it, drug legalization, or, you know, get your hands off my guns, you know, in the extreme form, you know, where these become push button issues, and they're all utilized to confuse and conflate. Now, just finally, in terms of the British Empire, who, by the way, it's now been at least 5 or 6 years ago, but when Glass-Steagall was being put forward as the alternative to Dodd-Frank, American economists were told by the British in London that Glass-Steagall would be casus belli, the reenactment of Glass-Steagall, you know, because of its threat to the city of London, their Wall Street, the city of London. But I wanted to just kind of underscore this in terms of this idea of the British Empire, which people have difficulty comprehending. The idea, of course, is, well, it doesn't exist. Well, besides what I just briefly summarized, look at the international drug trade. Now, you know, you have right now you have this question of immigration and the wall and so forth and so on. I'm not going to venture there right now. It would just take us too far afield. But let me underscore that building a wall is not going to stop narcotics trafficking across the border. And not for the reason many people would first think or would first come to mind. Drug traffickers come and go. including the big so-called kingpins. They come and go. You know, El Chapo is here in a prison in the United States now. You know, that didn't stop anything. He'll be replaced. He's already been replaced. You know, that's par for the course. What will continue throughout this is the laundering of drug monies. The monies gained out of the growing and consumption and therefore destruction of human lives, that money will continue to flow. And it'll flow through banks like HSBC, formerly known as the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, the very bank that ran for the British the opium trade in China, into China, or was one of the central banks along with Jardine Matheson and so forth and so on, that were the keystone banks of the whole opium trade. Opium largely grown in India and shipped into China and forced down their throats. And the opium wars enforced that policy, as many of you know. HSBC is officially one of the biggest drug money launderers around, slapped on the wrist by the US Justice Department, but that's all that was done. But it's also Bank of America, it's also Wells Fargo, and so on and so forth. These banks have all been caught red-handed in laundering knowingly, wittingly, drug monies, large amounts of cash from the Sinaloa cartel, et cetera, right? So that's on the table. Well, but do you hear, are we hearing yet? Maybe we'll hear it, hopefully we will hear it from the new Trump administration, because of some of the people coming in who have had a past experience in the military, representing the United States in Ibero-America. We may begin a serious anti-drug effort in coordination and collaboration with our fellow American national presidents throughout the Americas. That could be done. But again, this comes back to the question of shutting down the illegal predatory financial activities that have done so much to ruin our own nation and the nations of the Americas and elsewhere. But one of the centers also of this international drug trafficking, just to point this out, if you remember the Panama Papers, is the Caribbean. The Commonwealth countries of the Caribbean, right, is a major center of money laundering, of tax evasion, money moving not out of the Americas, but also out of Africa into the Caribbean, into post office boxes there that are supposedly banks and so forth. And from there, what's the center of the spider web? The spider web is in London. And again, this is documented again and again and again. The center of the monies from drug trafficking, besides those that come into the United States itself, flow into London, flow into places like New York, and flow into London. So this is not something that has been happening. Think of all that you've heard about, you know, the Bahamas and these, you know, this is where you can hide your cash, or this is where you can move your money, or this is where so-and-so, you know, hid their money, and all this kind of thing, whether it's Hollywood stars or fly-by-night financial operators or whatever. What's that all about? This is all, you know, this is the British Commonwealth. The British Commonwealth is headed by the Queen of England. That's the facts. So don't think for a minute that the British Empire disappeared. It just changed its name. I'll leave it with that. But this question, this is what's behind Mnuchin. This is Soros. This is Mnuchin. This is the operation coming from outside the United States into the United States. And we got to free Trump. We got to keep Trump free from this apparatus. Because what we're really concerned about is the soul of the United States, the future of the United States. and we've got to make the process work, the political process work. Glass-Steagall. This is, again, we're on the offensive here. The hysteria of the enemy is because they themselves are desperate. They've lost control of the United States, at least temporarily. And clearly Trump is not, at this point, willingly going along with what has been the agenda of the last 40, 50 years of geopolitics and the special relationship. We now have resolutions, a new resolution introduced in support of Glass-Steagall into the Delaware state legislature. That was yesterday, Friday, that was announced. We now have the 4 laws of LaRouche, of Glass-Steagall, national banking, national credit, and a crash fusion science program introduced by legislatures in New Mexico and Washington state, and it passed last year passed the Illinois state legislature. We have a national petition drive going on, initiated by the Our Revolution in Ohio grouping. And we've picked that up and we're expanding that petition drive, and we're now posting it elsewhere. And the point is to expand that. We now have February 28th set for us. That's the date at which President Trump is now set to address a joint session of Congress. And the petition is calling on President Trump to announce his support and that he's putting his weight behind the introduction of Glass-Steagall legislation in that speech, if not moving on it before. So we have this nodal point now in terms of this fight, in terms of Mnuchin. We have the February 28th date, which is 4 weeks away roughly. We have that window to drive forward the Glass-Steagall fight. Just to mention a couple of other things, as you know, President Putin of Russia is on the phone, actually probably right now, with President Donald Trump. They both have their teams assembled around them in these discussions. These are not just one-on-one discussions, but you know, there's really a party on each end of the phone listening in as these two men discuss what could be a very significant turning point. We'll see what evolves out of that. I want to mention it, and also President Trump had a discussion with Shinzo Abe, the president of Japan, and they've agreed that Shinzo Abe will be coming to the United States next month in February, which is also a positive development, particularly given the fact that Japan is now working increasingly closely with Russia on Far East economic development, including the Kuril Islands. I want to mention as well, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard is back from Syria. You may have seen coverage of this. This is very important. She met with President Assad. She met with people of all walks of life in Syria. Videotapes are available on YouTube of that. I encourage you to check them out and gain insights from her personal intervention there, including in Aleppo. I mean, here the press, the Western press can't go to Aleppo. You know, they're reporting from London or somewhere on what's going on in Aleppo. Well, Tulsi Gabbard was there in Aleppo. I think that's worth pointing out. Now, finally, moving into the economics and what I want to get to in terms of LaRouche's concept of energy flux density, we now have this issue, as you know, also before Congress, which we have the issue of infrastructure, the building of infrastructure now before Congress. We have 2 or 3, you could say at least 3, maybe more proposals now. You have the original, if you will call it that, the original infrastructure bank proposal circulated by Wilbur Ross for the Trump campaign before the election. It came out approximately a month before the November 8th election. You have the proposal by The bill introduced by Rosa DeLauro of Connecticut with 73 co-sponsors, HR 547, which proposes to use a certain amount of federal money, but then piggybacking on it the money of pension funds and other funds to fund something on the order of $1 trillion worth of infrastructure over approximately a decade. You have also a proposal from Schumer, Senator Schumer of New York, Democrat, which somewhat overlaps with DeLauro's bill introduced into the House, which is calling for using federal funds that would come from somewhere to also finance something like $1 trillion worth of infrastructure. And in both cases, they spell out some kind of sense of so much would be sent for bridges, so much for railroads, so much for this, so much for that. Our point has been and continues to be they won't work. As they're put forward, these proposals won't work. And we're going to get into some of that in the more deeper sense with this concept of energy flux density in terms of actually how do you measure economic activity, productive activity, and economic growth in real terms. But to summarize here quickly, the problem is if it's left in monetary terms, and that's the terms in which all three of these proposals are being couched, these proposals are going to self-destruct. If you engage in federal activity, if the U.S. government simply sells more debt to finance $1 trillion worth of activity, interest rates are going to rise, and that's going to affect everybody. That's going to affect the bond markets. It's going to affect outstanding debt. It's going to affect credit card debt. It's going to affect, it's going to be inflationary at this point. The U.S. economy has already piled on tremendous debt over the last 16 years, fighting some 17 wars at least around the world. And that has, that is accumulated on the books. So if you move now to now increase the amount of federal indebtedness, well, the consequences are going to be very real. And it's not simply going to be the $1 trillion, it's going to be its impact on triggering rising interest rates as not only we, but the world assesses where the US dollar is going and so on and so forth under those conditions. On the other hand, the idea that you're going to get hedge funds and so forth, as in the Wilbur Ross proposal to finance a infrastructure bank, where they're looking for short-term returns. They're looking for a profit. You're talking about immediate turnaround. So the projects that would be built, as we've emphasized before, and not only by ourselves but others as well, is that this proposal means that you're simply going to be financing things like toll roads. It's not going to be substantive in terms of a transformation of the U.S. economy in positive terms. It's going to be worse than digging holes and filling them in. And the prospects of counting on pension funds and so forth to put their money into an infrastructure bank also depends on those pension funds gaining a rate of return, right, that would make them profitable, and so on. The also related proposal that's come out and been circulated more recently is this idea of lowering the corporate tax rates to encourage the billions of dollars that U.S. corporations currently hold abroad and don't want to bring back into the United States, because if they brought it back, they would then have to pay taxes on those profits. And so they hold their profits abroad. They hold that money abroad and invest it abroad and so forth. And if you lowered the tax rate by 15%, 20%, there's different figures that Trump is talking about and others are talking about, well, then that money coming back in could be invested in infrastructure. Well, again, those corporate interests, they have chief financial officers, they have stockholders. They're going to want a rate of return on infrastructure investment. And that rate of return will not wait 20 years or for generations. If you build a national high-speed rail system, which is one component of what would really transform the economic base of the United States economy, transform it permanently, it will take a generation to build that out, at least. So in terms of real economic development, in terms of developing what LaRouche defines as a platform, a new economic platform, as opposed to just building infrastructure, you're talking about a generational process. You're talking about something that therefore requires the kind of commitment that only the US government itself can make. As with the space program, as just an indication, or with what Franklin Roosevelt did, or the Transcontinental Railroad, or railroads, plural. So you're talking about a different order of magnitude here, something that cannot operate in the concepts of monetarism, of the profit motive in terms of short-term expediency, which is the world that we're operating in right now, which is crashing, which is shut down the actual agro-industrial base of the U.S. economy. So that requires a national bank, a national infrastructure bank, something of that sort, but as a federal agency, which would take in capital. And we have a very interesting proposal that was made this last week by the head of the Chinese Investment Corporation. Speaking in Hong Kong, the chairman of the Chinese Investment Corporation, which is one of China's sovereign wealth funds. It has over $1 trillion in assets. It owns $200 billion, just this one sovereign wealth fund, $200 billion in US government securities. And he proposed that, that they were interested and would much rather invest at least 40% of that $200 billion into US infrastructure. And he also talked about manufacturing, than to have it sitting in low yield US government bonds. Now, that's one sovereign wealth fund. He actually heads up two, so you don't know if he's talking, you can see that he's talking in different terms, all right? Similarly, Japan. President Trump is going to be meeting with President Abe, Shinzo Abe, this coming month. They've already had discussions. Japan also holds over $1 trillion in US government securities. China holds collectively over $1 trillion in US government securities. As with the debt of the United States after the American Revolution, where Americans across the land held various forms of debt from the colonies, from the Continental Army, from the Continental Congress, and so on. And that paper was being marked down as in the phrase, not worth a continental. Hamilton and foreigners held debt of the new American nation as well in different forms, because we had gotten help from the League of Armed Neutrality, France, from Russia, and so on, so individual as well as government. Hamilton, in setting up the National Bank of the United States, with the support of Congress and of course of the President George Washington, set it up from the standpoint of saying, all of you that hold this debt, of the collective colonies and so forth, well, we're now, under the new Constitution, we've now brought that all under the umbrella of the federal government. It is now all the debt of us, the federal government. We're taking it out of the hands of the colonies, what had been the colonies, which are now the states. This is now the debt of the United States. We, collectively, we, the federal government, we represent the people, now owe this debt. And we're going to make good on it. We're offering you to put this money into a national bank, the first national bank of the United States. To put it in, we will give you in return U.S. bonds, effectively, U.S. government bonds from the national bank notes, if you want to put it in another term, which will bear a return of 5%. If you want, you can get land as partial payment, and the rest in these bonds or bank notes, which will return 5%. And we will back this up by a revenue stream of taxes in the form of tariffs, taxes on whiskey and other items, similar kinds of items, domestically as well as imported. And that revenue stream, as passed by the U.S. Congress, was totally dedicated to redeeming the national debt. So, okay, there's a revenue stream, it backs up the bank, and all of these different forms of paper came flowing in as investments into the U.S. National Bank. The money issued from that national bank then circulated as good as gold throughout the country as currency, because it was backed up, right? Not just by a national bank, that alone by its name wouldn't do it, but it was backed up by the commitment of the nation and by a revenue stream in terms of taxation. I've summarized it. I hope that's clear, at least in terms of a summary. We encourage, again, people to read the report on the National Bank, to read that report. It's available on our website, and it's available otherwise through Amazon.com and so on and so forth, the 4 reports of Hamilton. But again, fast forward, here we are today. China is offering to take what? The debt of the United States that it holds and put hundreds of billions of it into a infrastructure vehicle, right? That then they're not proposing to buy infrastructure. They're proposing to put it in as capital into such a financial institution, a vehicle. You could call it the National Bank, you could call it blue cheese, you could call it whatever you want, but the function of that institution would be capitalized, would then to lend a multiple in the form of credits out from that institution for infrastructure. Large scale, major projects, prioritized projects, that would be prioritized from the get-go, right? Very publicly, and carried forward with the support of the Congress and the American people. So we had a discussion of this with Gene Green the other night, at least a brief discussion, and he was trying to wrap his mind around it, that here the Chinese, they hold all of our, debt, and, they got all these bonds and so forth. And you're saying they could bring it back and they would invest in it here, and it would help build infrastructure, But that's how it will work, right? Maybe he'll work it through in his mind. Hopefully he will. We'll certainly encourage him to.
What do the Chinese get out of that? Or is it just humanity?
Well, it's win-win. This is the kind of win. This is the win-win cooperation of the new Silk Road, right? Of the Belt and Road Initiative that China's carrying out with all these other countries. And there's now just the other day it was announced there's going to be a brand new spanking new port in Angola, which China's financing. They're going to be building with the Angolan government and with Angolan companies and employees and so on and so forth. A huge port in Angola. But, Ethiopia, Nigeria, you name it, Pakistan and so forth. What does China get out of it? They're getting future markets. Building up these nations in Africa is building up future markets for Chinese goods and the ability for China to buy from those countries things that it requires or will require, right? In terms of more immediately, in terms of the answer to the question, the chairman of the Chinese Investment Corporation was saying, we're getting almost, no interest on our bonds, now.
Right.
If we invested in infrastructure, we're sure we would get a better return. So it would be better for us. But, they're looking at it from this standpoint that the worst thing that could happen, he didn't say this, but think about it. The worst thing that could happen to China is if the U.S. economy crashed.
Right.
The people that think that China is out to get the United States, no, they've got trillions of dollars of U.S. bonds and so forth. They've also invested in the United States, in industries, businesses, and so. If the U.S. crashes, they get wiped out, or hurt very badly. Right? More importantly than the paper is that all of that labor, all of those resources, everything that they produced to sell to us, for which they got these pieces of paper, will have just been, gone down the sinkhole. Right? Will have just disappeared, right? And they'll have nothing to show for it. So that's the real damage done. But they're thinking about it affirmatively. And Wilbur Ross, for example, who's the new incoming Commerce Secretary, has worked with CIC. So in terms of joint projects in the past. So the proposal being made by the chairman of CIC was not something just being made, kind of throwing it over the wall. There's people on the other side of the wall in terms of the Trump administration that would be able to discuss these kind of things. Know these communication channels. Right? So that's what would work. A national bank then issuing national credit, against a capitalized base, which will allow them to not simply finance $1 trillion, but that the capital of such a bank could be $1 trillion or a multiple of $1 trillion, coming from Japan, coming from China, coming from other sources, including in the United States, including state governments and so on, that would want to put their money there for short-term reasons, as investment, tax revenues that aren't going to be spent for 6 months, that kind of thing. And so with trillions of dollars as a capital, the amount of lending for infrastructure would be on the order of at least 10 trillion, 20 trillion. In other words, you're beginning to talk about, as they used to say, real money and a real program. And the CIC chairman was saying, our view is that $1 trillion is not sufficient, that the U.S. requires at least 8 trillion to rebuild infrastructure. And we would emphasize in our pamphlet that we're going to be publishing, and the one that we've already published from the LaRouche PAC pamphlet on a domestic infrastructure program to join, so to speak, the Silk Road, obviously it goes beyond that. So we're talking about a scope of 20, 30, 40 trillion dollars in terms of an overall program perspective that would build out a new platform, a new future for the United States, and would pick up really where we left off at the time of the unfortunate death of Franklin Roosevelt before the end of World War II, in terms of the perspective he had for the post-World War II period. But infrastructure is on the table. This is going to be moving forward. If Trump wants to succeed, and we all can agree that he has a big ego, and he wants to succeed, he wants to do things big, he wants to succeed big, this is the way that can work. And the other proposals don't. They're short, they're cheap, chump change compared to what's needed, and in terms of the scale of what really Trump has already made clear he wants to do. So let me turn, if there's not further immediate questions, let me turn to some of LaRouche's economic concepts, but specifically energy flux density, and bring that to bear in this. We've got and we'll have some overheads on this as well. We're talking, when we look at the economy, forget about money, dollars and cents. We first of all can think about the economy as a totality. To abstract, as Lynn does in terms of principles, we can look at it from the standpoint of the energy of the system. You have, and that, what are we saying there in terms of thermodynamics? We're using a term out of thermodynamics. The energy of the system, that's the system that's required to keep that system running, from one cycle to the next, whether you're talking about day to day or year to year. That's, at least we'll use that kind of frame of reference. That's the energy of the system. Before there was fire, before man discovered fire, the energy of the system, the energy of a person, was about 100 watts. You run on about 100 watts. Okay, that's what you're running on. if you have a caloric intake of about 2,500 calories, which a lot of people don't have these days in the world, but if you're running on about 100 watts, and so the amount of work you can do is in that sense defined by that 100 watts. But we're now talking about the economy as a whole, the energy of the system. Well, then, there's the energy of the system, and then there's what gets produced in any given cycle. And if people are productive, at least some of the people, hopefully a lot of the people, there's something more produced. And thermodynamically, you can call it free energy. I mean, just think about it. Looking at the economy as just one integrated whole, agro-industrial, whole, right? And you're looking at it as it reproduces, right? So there's not what keeps it going. That's, like the bare minimum at any moment in time, unless you want to go downhill. That's entropy. But if you want, and then there's free energy. Now, if you reinvest the free energy into the system, if you reinvest the free energy into the system, well, this is kind of an assumption that may come up in the back of your mind, or you've wondered about, or whatever. If you reinvest that free energy into the system, well, then now that system becomes bigger. I mean, there's more energy being used in that system. Well, then it's going to take more energy to maintain that system. And so, isn't this going to lead to a problem? I mean, I guess you could say it's a little like overeating. If you went much above 2,400 calories a day, it's 35, 40, 4,000, whatever. Anyway, your arteries are going to clog. So isn't this going to dead end here? And the secret is to this paradox, and it's a paradox in people's thinking, because people don't think these things through rigorously. And so LaRouche, in his textbook back in 1984, so you wish to learn all about economics, and a subtitle, a text on elementary mathematical economics. And there's a I think it's 2-hour-long video, Power of Labor, that goes along with it. Was presenting some of these paradoxes to get people to begin thinking about, freeing themselves imaginatively to think about the economy, in fresh terms. Well, the difference he specified, what has to be taken into account is the economy of labor. That's the term that gets used, or has been used in the past. The economy of labor. That is, that as this free energy is reintroduced into the economy, if it's utilized effectively, efficiently, the cost of producing a given amount of energy is reduced. The idea of efficiency or concentrating energy, these are ways you can think about it in in initial terms. But you're talking about in a multitude of ways. You're talking about new inventions, the use of that free energy to build something. If you have more free energy, if your hours of work are reduced, or say the Tennessee Valley Authority lights your farm, which normally everything just basically shut down when the sun went down, right? Except for what you could do with a lamp. If you suddenly have a light bulb, suddenly you have hours that you didn't have before. It's not hours to feed the pigs or something, right? It's hours that you can use in some other way, to read, to study agronomy, to study other areas, to teach your kids, right? Suddenly, the productivity is increased. And the result of that increased productivity through new inventions and so forth is to reduce the cost of producing a kilowatt of energy, for example. So the cycle is not that you're constantly increasing the energy, the point is that you're reducing the costs. You could say the human cost of producing that energy. So if we could go to that, we have this first, could you turn off that light here? Thanks, Joe.
Do you want that diagram there?
Yeah, I'm going to come back to it in a second. Just a second.
If you don't mind, I like to angle this light up a little bit so it's hitting your face too when you're in. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, here we have on the screen energy flux density. Now, this is on our website. I really encourage people to go. If you go to the LaRouche PAC website, not the Schiller Institute website, but LaRouche PAC has this. If you go to the LaRouche PAC website, LaRouchePAC.com, at the very top of the homepage, there's a set of tabs, and one of them is Our Policies. And if you go to if you click on that Our Policies, a menu drops down, and one of those is energy flux density. Many others. You have tons of fun exploring that website. But this is on the homepage of energy flux density, that subset, that submenu that you go to. If you notice from left to right, you're going from, the idea is here, you're going from manual labor, right? Obviously working with machinery, and so what you can imagine maybe a furnace or whatever the process there, but manual labor. Moving to the right, you're looking at welding, some kind of advanced, probably electrical welding going on. And then on the far right, you have even a further sophistication, working on probably some fusion device, not a full-blown tokamak or something, but some kind of test device going on, in which the energy of a single atom or atoms is the work is to release the energy through fusion of atoms of enormous amounts of energy, the energy of the sun. And this progress is what we're talking about. But if you could go to the cone. Thank you. The one just above it. Yeah, there. Okay, so if you can see, here you have a cone, obviously, and it's flattened out here in 2 dimensions, but I think it's clear enough. Think of it, the cone as representing growth of the population. And you see that slice there, the lower slice in the cone, and then you see up above, at the top of it, you see another, what I'm calling slice, horizontal line, right? And those are 2 points in the process of the economy. Disregard what's to the right. This is on the well-tempered scale as it's mapped on a cone. There's more applications of conic functions, but go to the next one. It's the best one I can find on short notice. Now, take from the standpoint of basically where A is, little a, midway up, and B, take that as one slice, one leap, shall we see, in technology. That cut in the cone, if you know an ellipse has two foci, right? The cut in that cone represents, in terms of the action, the least action that differentiates from the lower to the upper horizontal lines. The least action is that leap of ideas, of technologies, of the equivalent of a renaissance that allows that leap from one, from say a coal-fired economy to a petroleum-fired economy or to a nuclear economy. It's just a way of, go to the last one that you have there, the very last slide. So we take this out of the abstract again. Here's the development of the U.S. economy, or mankind. As I mentioned before, before the development of fire, the power rate, you could say the power rating is 100 watts. you're running on 100 watts, which is a pretty amazing thing to think that the human body runs on 100 watts equivalent of calories of energy. Pretty efficient. The development of fire, of course, transformed it, and that, of course, differentiates man from beasts. You know, the way an archaeologist discovers where man is as opposed to animals is you find the pits, the fire pits. That's the first thing. Start from there. There's no animal that builds fires. Well, wood-fired economy, you know, cutting down trees, burning wood. By the time of the founding of the United States, that's what we had basically, had gotten us up to about 24 to 3,000 watts per capita in terms of the energy that was being utilized. The economy was running per capita on about 2,400, 3,000 calories per person. Watts. But yeah, watts, not if I say kilowatts, thanks. We were already, of course, beginning, even from the early days, beginning to work with coal, and by the time of the 1920s, we had a coal-fired economy. Now, think in each case, these open entirely new domains. You know, coal, it burns much hotter, much more efficiently. And there's a lot of coal, and you can run you can run steam engines, you can run all kinds of things on coal, which is in terms of a general usage that are not possible with and electricity, production of electricity and so forth in a coal economy. At that point, we're up to 5,000 watts per capita, running on 5,000 watts per capita. Moving to a petroleum and natural gas and partial nuclear economy by the 1970s, we were at 10,000 watts. These are the kinds of leaps, right? These are the kinds of leaps in the economy that is made possible by mankind's ingenuity, creativity. What is that? That is that man's ability to grasp principles, to discover principles, and how does he know that they work, these principles? By how they're applied, to how they cause an increase of the productivity and the population density of the economy. And we'll come back to that. Now, if we hadn't had the green movement, if we hadn't had what began in spades with 1971 with the dollar being taken off the gold standard and the whole decoupling of the economy from the real economy, the so-called service economy, you know, casino economy that's grown since, we would have easily reached 40,000 watts per capita long before now, by the beginning of by the say year 2000, including the development of fusion, beginning to bring fusion online. But again, that implies not just simply those things as power sources. It would have meant a whole array of applications in other fields. So go back to to one of the early ones is a population. If there's a question or something, I'll be glad to take a question, but otherwise I'll try to keep moving here. I'm sorry?
This one?
Yes, yes. So this is in broad brushstrokes the growth of the U.S. population, or the world population, right? Up until the year 2000. You can think about these in terms of the kind of periods these represent. The development of Judeo-Christian civilization, the Renaissance, earlier the development of nation states, thinking of Athens, but also think of city-states in China and so forth, India, and so on and so forth, earlier periods. This growth, and you see there, knitted into this graph, you have these key developments in terms of technologies along the way, in terms of iron weapons, coal, steam engines, oil and gas, and so on and so forth. So So could you flip the light switch there, Belinda? Thanks. I just put up here, and people may be wondering why it's behind me here, but since I couldn't find it in terms of an overhead, a PowerPoint slide, I just drew it on the board here. This is two intersecting cones, as you can see. One is the cone that we've been talking about, that we can heuristically talk about in terms of the growing cone representing growing population, which is only made possible through these constant transformations, through new singularities in terms of new ideas and the application of those ideas as science and culture. The other cone is in the inverse. What is this? Well, this is the growing energy flux density that I've been talking about. That is that man is increasingly focusing, focusing his knowledge, focusing his attention, but applying energy in increasingly concentrated forms. We have just continue on. And so the actual process involves, this kind of interlocking conic process. We have the example of lasers, starting with the simple ruby laser here I have up here. You can hit the lights again. Sorry, Belinda. You're going back to the 1960s, beginning about 1960. The first ruby laser, if I remember right, an artificial ruby was used. You're using what you have in a simple your phone camera. You take a flash picture with your what's now in a phone camera. Number one there is that device flashing, and of course you can speed up or slow down the number of flashes. But that flash of electromagnetic energy, light, is then being pumped into that red is it's supposed to be a ruby laser, simple ruby laser, which is absorbing that energy. And as it absorbs that energy, it begins releasing photons. Those photons then begin hitting, begin bouncing around, and that energy and the agitation and so forth releases more. At the ends of this ruby laser, on number 6 there, you have a mirror on the far end on the left. On the right is also a mirror, but you have a small area there, right? You can see it's where it's coming out there, number 8. It's coming out there. That arrow is coming out. These photons are increasing the number of them being released to singularities, and it increasingly orders itself and comes out what's the term? It's on the tip of my tongue. Yeah, coherent beam, right? Of energy. Now, another way to think about it is a knife blade. You hit something with a sledgehammer, you get one result. With a hammer. You know this from working at home. That hammer. If you use a knife, she has an apartment building. She has to constantly repair something. But if you use a knife, right, you get something more, right? A knife or a pair of scissors, the blades on a pair of scissors cut through something, which if you try to use a hammer, you just make a mess out of it, out of the whatever you were trying to cut. And you certainly want to cut through cheese with a hammer, right? Huh? Beard, yeah, right. Yeah, use a hammer on your face, yeah, as opposed to a razor blade, right? In other words, you organize, you concentrate the energy on a very small surface, right? It's the energy of the whole thing, but it's concentrated there, and can accomplish far more work. Now, maybe a different kind of work, but suddenly a whole new domain opens up, right? So with lasers, I think it was by 62, if I remember right, by 62, the first surgeries were being performed using lasers, to zap tumors in the eye. Right? Just within 2 years or so after the first laser was, or maser as they first called them, was built. But you're talking about etching ceramics to build computer chips. All the rest of this stuff has come along with it. Farmers use lasers to level the land. Working off of satellite information. To determine exactly what is level or not level, which can be very important if you're planting rice, for example, and you want the water to be completely leveled out across the land. You don't want it draining off to one side and rotting out half your crop. You want it utilized equivalently across the whole land area. On and on and on. And now, of course, we're using lasers. We have a picture there. Well, we have that original picture, but of lasers being used to focus energy on a single pellet of deuterium tritium fuel to compress and heat that fuel to release fusion energy, the energy of the sun. This is a large, what's up there now is that's a large laser experiment related to fusion energy. It just gives you an idea of the size and complexity of these devices and the pumping process that's involved in these devices. You can pick and choose whatever seems to make sense, Mike.
Okay, all right. Well,
So this process of well, yeah, here we have. I mean, we've opened up we have an electromagnetic economy in part now, right? We have the utilization. This is kind of old-fashioned here. You're from broadcast radio down in the radio wave range. Microwaves on up to the use for medicines and so on. There's the next one. There's another chart right following it. The next one. Cell phones, so forth. All of these things we're tapping a whole range, right? And it's not simply the matter of using more energy. We're also at the same time have learned how to use the resistance to energy of different materials to slow its use, to slow the flow of energy for specific purposes. So we have transformers, we have conductors, we have different resistance elements built into chips and so forth, so that chips can perform multiple activities. Just another feature of it. It's not simply more energy, but again, how you utilize it, how you not only utilize that energy in terms of a focused energy, but how do you manipulate that energy and utilize it with various materials, including new materials. We have rare earth materials, right, which have become a major component of the economy. They're just identified there quickly. I'm not going to go through. They're the ones that have all these weird iums endings, right? Lanthanum, cerium, neodymium, promethium. That's a nice one. I like that one. Erbium, lutetium, and so on and so forth. Rare earth materials, which have all kinds of applications, but your cell phone wouldn't operate with them. You wouldn't have DVDs. You wouldn't have displays, computer displays. These rare earth materials are everywhere on Earth, but they're only found in some places in sufficient concentration, and they're usually found together, all of them. They're all kind of mixed in together. So you have, go on to some others. This is just some of the uses for them. But catalysts, I mean, catalytic converters and so forth, all kinds of metallurgy, alloys, and so on. Go to the next one.
But the recent discoveries, right?
Right. This is all recent in terms of discovering their utilization and how they can be utilized. Yeah. And this is how the production has expanded massively. And China is now the biggest producer of them by far. And go on to the next. Back up.
Shifting gears.
Yeah, shifting gears. That's jumping too far ahead. But I think I have one there that shows the amount of rare earths that exists. rare earths are not rare.
Oh,
They're not. Rare earths are rare earth metals. They're your rare earth oxide, which is the form they come in terms of
who gave them the name
utilization.
rare then? Why do they call them rare?
It should be up further at the top, Mike.
Further up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, maybe it's not there. Maybe it got lost.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's okay.
I don't see one.
That's okay, Mike.
Okay.
We're gonna. That's all right. I guess it got lost. Excuse me. That's my fault. It was just one showing supplies. I mean, you know, we're using up tons a year, but what exists is hundreds of thousands of tons of each one of these rare earths. So, you know, and the question, China's producing it because they're producing it cheaper. You know, it also exists in California. There's large supplies in Brazil, India. I mean, you know, it's not like a shortage, but it's a whole new domain which is opened up. And what lies beyond this, and what new applications and so forth. But the same process, here we come to the next slide. This process of development, this process of increasing energy flux density that we see with the progress of mankind, we see with the progress of the United States that we showed in terms of watts per person, is also what we find in nature. I mean, again, this goes to the axioms. Many of you know this, the axioms that somehow man is operating contrary to nature or contrary to the universe. Well, we you know, just drawing on numbers of scientific studies. Again, you can find this on the Energy Flux Density website. Benjamin Deniston has written a wonderful article a couple years back now, Biospheric Energy Flux Density. And it's summarizing a body of work done by various specialists, botany, biology, and so on and so forth. You go back through the historical record, you pull this data out, and you see this transformation going on in terms of, here we have diversity, in terms of the number of families in each of these categories, what we categorize as amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, and so forth. And you can see over time, going back to 540 million years ago on up to through the Cenozoic, this transformation, right? Where first amphibians were the largest in terms of the number of families within its species, and then it drops off. Reptiles, then you have the development of birds and mammals, right, taking over, right? In terms of the numbers of species, you would get similar charts if you took the total number of mammals versus the total number of reptiles or amphibians, more or less the same transformation. Each one of these leaps occurs with an increase of the energy throughput of that body. You know, I was probably speaking of man using 100 watts, each of us using approximately 100 watts of energy continually to keep our lights on, so to speak. Similarly, you have this growing development and, of course, increasing diversity or diversity of functions within the animal as well, but also the increasing energy throughput. Go on to the next. Reflecting this same process of the U.S. development. Go ahead. Here we have this shows a relationship. You see again the different categories. You know, salamanders, for example, reptiles, lizards, mammals, birds, and this is based on the number of grams, the size of the animal, how much the animal weighs, and as you go further up in weight, the amount of energy consumed per gram, I guess you could say, drops off. But the differentiation remains the same. Birds, mammals having the highest rates of energy utilization to body mass relative to the others. Go ahead. I'm just indicating here. I'm not trying to drown you in this. I'm I'm just trying to give you a sense of this overall. Another way of shifting here, think of this in terms of non-free swimming mammals. Again, over the development from 540 million years ago through the Cenozoic. The increasing growth in free swimming animals, you know, as away from mollusks and clams and so on and so forth. Go to the next. It's just to give you a sense. I mean, people don't have this. I mean, it's not provided, right? Just the shift within, you know, from these brachiopods, cruder, simpler species of bivalves, or brachiopods, to bivalves, you know, in terms of this shift from the Paleozoic to Mesozoic. Go ahead. That's pod. Yeah. Brachiopod. Thank you.
And that is an animal that is just like a clam.
Yeah, something very simple.
Very simple.
Simplest,
Okay.
almost clam. Yeah. But even within plants, right, from fern-like plants to gymnosperms to angiosperms, again, you see this development in terms of how plants reproduce and their efficiency at reproducing. It's why you have weeds in your yard all the time. If you dig up ground, it's going to be covered, particularly here in Houston, in a very short period of time.
It's
with
different up
green
further
stuff.
north. The more north you go, it's different.
Go on to the next. I think we're just about there. Well, man and God in man's image. That's what I had in terms of the ideas I wanted to throw out. Just and I hope I've introduced you to the concept of energy flux density and its relation to potential relative population density. I guess I should define that term a little bit, since I've said it a few times. Everybody knows what population density is. The population density of someplace like Copenhagen is orders of magnitude greater than the population density in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. Orders of magnitude. And the population of Copenhagen is orders of magnitude greater than that of the United States. However you want to think about the population density. Relative population density, this is a term, again, defined by LaRouche. Relative population density, of course, is just land varies. So some land, more people can be supported on it, other land, less. Potential is what is the potential number of people that could be supported on a given hectare or acre of land, or however you wish to define it. And so LaRouche is saying, in terms of the physical bases of looking at and defining economic policy, defining value, that's a good way of putting it. How do we define real value? Well, what is the value of something? How does it contribute to the further advancement of mankind? We can kind of agree that that's a general concept. Okay, but what do we look at in terms of parameters? We look at increasing rates of energy flux density, and we look at the contribution to increasing the potential relative population potential density. So right there, you're going right at the green zero growther entropic concept. You're saying there's never been any grounds for that, as we went through at the beginning. The paradox of free energy is that it's not just increasing the amount of plaque in your veins, so to speak, of the economy. It's increasing, it contributes when utilized, and that's a willful process by mankind. It increases our productivity, it increases our creativity, and lowers the cost of the very energy that we're consuming. So that there is no limits to growth. And so in that way, so set that aside, put that aside. What will a high-speed rail system do for the United States? Well, even the Economist of London had a set of articles a week ago or so, you can look them up, in which they begrudgingly admitted that China's high-speed rail system is working, that it's not this boondoggle that's going to drown China in debt, because something on the order of 50, 60%, some places 40%, it varies, of the people taking the high-speed rail trains are people that never took transportation at all, ever went anywhere before, or if they're going on trips they never went on before. In other words, businesses and families, communities, and so forth are finding that the systems that they built is increasing the economic activity, the productivity, and growth of the Chinese economy, which of course is the point. I mean, that's what the Transcontinental Railroad did, right? It allowed us to begin filling in the middle of the country, not just with people, but suddenly land and resources and raw materials and so on that were untapped were available. You know, they could be both reached in terms of resources being brought in, but also in terms of resources going out and so forth. And whole new cities and so on were built up. And suddenly a site in the middle of nowhere was a wonderful site because it was by a river, but it was also, there was a railroad coming through there, right? So anyway, so the way in which these things develop corridors of economic development is an example of the way in which these transformations of economic platforms transform the potential of everybody. It's not a one-on-one thing, it's a transformation of the entire productive potential of not just an entire single community, but an entire nation. And that's what you're looking at in terms of this kind of conic, if you will, expansion, this growth, or using that as a heuristic device to indicate the process. So, China's showing it. I mean, they're doing it, and they're just proving these bean counters. You know, these money, when you're spending so much money, and how are you going to get it back? You know, how are you going to collect enough money from all these people riding your train, you know, that it's going to pay, you know, that you're going to be able to pay for it? You're going to end up with the government in debt up to its eyeballs, having built all this stuff and never collecting the money back. Well, the point is the impact is measured otherwise, right? And it's, go ahead. Oh, Belinda had her hand up first. Joel, do you mind waiting for a second?
Okay. Well, there were two things I was going to say. One is that just how important these principles that you're laying out is right now, and urgent that we spread the understanding of this. Last night I was working a job, I didn't get off until 1 o'clock in the morning, and I was driving home and I was listening. I can't stand NPR anymore because it's like, you know, it's
neocon garbage. You know, NPR is neocon
gobbledygook.
Yeah.
Right? But the other, you know, thing I turned on was Fox, and I was listening to some talk guy, you know, blabbing on and on. And the guy was equating, first of all, he was talking about energy, the oil that Trump is now going to allow the
pipelines.
Yes, the pipeline.
He's
right, and
he's opening up the
about
possibility of those.
Solely in and of itself, money. You know, well, it's good, but it suddenly means that all those truck drivers and you know, the pipelines reduce the cost because it's now shipped by truck and rail. Right? So if you switch from truck and rail to pipeline, it's going to reduce the cost, right? Because the truck drivers and the rail drivers, they charge more than a pipeline or something like that. Right? So it's saying it'll reduce the cost. But that means all these truck drivers are going to be unemployed. And I mean, you know, like what happened to the fact that we couldn't deliver our food last year out of the grain silos because of the clogging of the
railroad lines with all the oil tankers.
Oil tankers, right? I mean, complete idiocy. And then he throws in the same sentence the people who oppose oil and energy to the people who love high-speed rail, right? It says that they're the same people, right? I mean, in other words, they're so idiotic. They're so fixated on point, money, you know, small little thinking, right? So anyway, I just had to bring that up, how urgent it is that we educate people right now about these things. The second thing is I was just thinking about on this question of potential relative population density, and I know you were going through it, and I had to take a call and leave for a minute. But you know, if you took like two areas of land that had the same relative soil condition or whatever, and you know, but one of them is, you know, dirt road and a few houses on it or whatever, right? And the other one is, you know, you take that same condition, but then you add a network of, you know, rail, like you're talking about, how that potential density
It's changed, transformed.
Has changed.
Yeah.
And, you know, you add energy, same thing. Add a university, right? Because then you've got the development of the mental potential.
Very good
All of
example,
this
very good.
increasing.
Yeah, very good.
Anyway, I just was thinking about that because I think that sometimes the words trip people up, but that all of those things contribute to the level of potential relative population density and
Transform the culture and transform
everything, right? And
relations among people.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So,
Glad you brought that up. Yep.
Oh, there was a report about the Chinese New Year this
Oh,
weekend.
yeah.
And they were estimating that over 3 million trips will be taken over the next 2 weeks.
3 billion?
3 billion.
Wow.
I'll just repeat that. Just three in China
Families.
over the next 2 weeks because of the Lunar New Year period.
Today
Yeah, today is Lunar New Year, and then you have this period of family gatherings and so forth around it. So over three,
And they're using the high-speed rail.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's your point, that
Yeah.
they could not have done this before, this quantity or number of people.
right? Yeah, I can just add a note. You probably, I mean, this was the very basis of the designing of the Chinese high-speed rail system was the kind of litmus test or you know. Basis upon which the whole plan was drawn up and built. It hasn't been built, you know, a little here, there, and it all kind of jumbled and it all came together. It was designed and built up from the standpoint that the litmus test was if they could move the entire population that moved over the Lunar New Year period efficiently.
So that
That was the real, that was the you know, the basis for designing and continuing to build out the system is with that, because that's the biggest single, if you will, migration, not really migration, but movement of people anywhere on Earth. It's what occurs in the Lunar New Year period of that Lunar New Year and the celebrations around it, the family gatherings around it.
Is it now completely east to west in China, all the way across, or not?
Oh yeah, and on into Europe. It's if I maybe somebody can correct me. I believe now it's five. It's either 4 or 5 routes north south, and then 4 or 5 routes east west. So it's a grid.
From coast to
Right.
border.
It's not equal. You know, it takes into account terrain and cities and so on, but it's a grid. Yeah.
It's not all completed yet.
Yeah.
There's still a lot.
I saw the news, Taiwan, China, there's a talk show, they're talking about the high-speed railroad from the border of the China, Zhejiang, okay, from that place to all the way to United Kingdom on 18 days.
Yeah, the first train just in the last week or so, right?
Yeah.
Reached London from China.
No, that's not all high speed. That's
No, it's not.
No. The rail grid that Brian's talking about is high speed rail. They have 20,000 kilometers inside China, 20,000 kilometers, and I think by 2025 they intend to have 40,000.
Right.
So that's what they're building up in China, and to the extent the Silk Road grows and prospers, they're going to turn these slower railroads into high speed.
Yeah, there's already all kinds of plans being made for that. Be high speed.
Like they got that one that's going up
There's now 39, at last count, maybe more now, 39 routes across Eurasia. 39 different routes. You know, ending up in Madrid and Rotterdam and Paris, and from different cities in China, and Moscow and Mongolia and other points.
Gotta get that Bering Strait.
Yeah, that's what we got to dig that tunnel under the Bering Straits. Absolutely.
So that Palin probably goes Russia.
Yep, Sarah Palin will love it.
She can see it from her backyard.
All right.
I don't know if it was in the chart, but out of that 100 watts per person, 20 watts is just to keep the brain going.
Yeah.
All right.
Even though the brain is only 2%
Of the body mass.
It takes 20%.
The brain takes 20% of that 100 watts that we're running on. That's it.
Well, if you're out in the cold, you lose 30% of your heat from your head.
Off the top of your head. So don't lose your head.
Wear a hat, that's the point.
So why don't we wrap it there?